My wife demanded a divorce and full custody. "You'll never see the kids again," she screamed. My mother wept, begging me not to accept it. I told the judge, "Give her what she wants." Everyone in the courtroom looked at me with pity. She smiled victoriously as she left, unaware that I already had the lab results in my pocket. Her smile lasted until she read the one sentence on the paper that brought her to her knees on the sidewalk. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached." I sat in that courthouse chair, my hands folded calmly in my lap, watching my wife of 39 years destroy what was left of our family with a smile that could cut glass. The manila envelope in my jacket pocket felt heavier than it should have, considering it contained just 3 sheets of paper. But those 3 sheets held the power to change everything. "Your Honor," Brooks' attorney was saying, his voice echoing off the marble walls of courtroom B, "my client is asking for full custody of the minor children, along with spousal support of $4,000 per month and 50% of all marital assets." The judge, a woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back severely, glanced at me over her reading glasses. "Mr. Holloway, how do you respond to these requests?" I could feel my mother's eyes boring into the side of my head from the gallery behind me. At 85, she still had the posture of a schoolteacher, and I knew without looking that her mouth was pressed into that thin line she got when she was trying not to cry. She'd begged me not to come today. "Philip," she'd said just this morning, gripping my arm with hands that had grown fragile but never weak. "You don't have to give her everything. Fight for something." But she didn't understand. None of them did. "I accept all terms as presented," I said, my voice steady. The courtroom fell silent except for the hum of the old fluorescent lights overhead. Brooks' lawyer blinked. My own attorney, David Chen, a sharp young man I'd hired just 3 weeks ago, leaned forward in his chair. "Your Honor, my client would like a brief recess to discuss—" "No recess necessary," I interrupted, looking directly at the judge. "Give her what she wants." The judge frowned, studying me with the expression of someone who'd seen too many broken marriages but never quite like this. "Mr. Holloway, I want to be certain you understand what you're agreeing to. You're relinquishing custody of your 30-year-old daughter, Sophie, who still lives at home, and you're accepting a significant financial burden. Are you sure about this decision?" Behind me, I heard my mother's sharp intake of breath. The sound cut through me like a blade, but I didn't turn around. I couldn't. If I looked at her face, saw the confusion and heartbreak there, I might not be able to finish this. "I'm certain, Your Honor." Brooke was practically glowing. She sat at the plaintiff's table in her navy blue dress, the one she'd worn to Emma's wedding 7 years ago, her blonde hair perfectly styled despite the early morning hour. To anyone watching, she looked like a grieving wife who'd finally found the courage to leave a difficult marriage. She'd always been good at that, making herself look like the victim. "You'll never see the kids again," she had screamed at me just 2 weeks ago when I'd agreed to her divorce terms without a fight. We'd been standing in our kitchen, the same kitchen where we'd fed 3 babies, helped with homework, celebrated birthdays and graduations. The morning light coming through the windows made everything look golden and peaceful, completely at odds with the venom in her voice. "I'll make sure of that, Philip. You think you can just walk away from this family? You'll get nothing, nothing." I'd said nothing then, just like I was saying nothing now. What was the point? The truth would speak for itself soon enough. The judge was reading through the settlement terms, her voice formal and distant. Division of assets as follows. The family home at 243 Maple Street, valued at $450,000, to remain with Mrs. Holloway. Joint checking account containing $120,000 to be split equally. Mr. Holloway's pension and retirement accounts to remain his sole property, with the exception of spousal support payments as outlined. I watched Brooke's face as the judge spoke. She was trying to contain her satisfaction, but I'd been married to her for 39 years. I knew that look. It was the same expression she'd worn when she'd convinced the neighbors that our fence dispute was entirely my fault. The same look when she'd managed to get Emma to blame me for missing her college graduation because of a work emergency I couldn't avoid. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from Sophie. "Dad, I can't believe you're doing this. Call me." Sophie? My baby. 30 years old and still living at home while she tried to make it as an artist, still believing that families stick together no matter what. She had my eyes, my stubborn streak, my need to see the good in people even when they didn't deserve it. The thought of what I was about to tell her made my chest tight, but it had to be done. They all needed to know the truth. The judge was finishing up the custody arrangements. "Visitation rights for Mr. Holloway will be determined at a later date, pending—" She paused, looking at me again. "Mr. Holloway, are you absolutely certain you don't wish to contest any of these terms? This is highly unusual." I straightened my shoulders, feeling the weight of my father's watch on my wrist. He'd worn it for 47 years, through his own marriage, through raising 5 kids, through every difficult decision a man has to make. "I'm certain, Your Honor. I want to give my wife exactly what she's asking for." The emphasis on exactly wasn't lost on David. I saw him glance at me sharply, probably wondering why I'd insisted on keeping him in the dark about my strategy. But this wasn't about legal maneuvering. This was about truth and timing and making sure that when the earthquake hit, everyone would know exactly where the fault lines had been all along. Brooks' attorney was shuffling his papers, barely able to contain his own satisfaction. This was probably the easiest divorce case he'd ever handled. No fighting over assets, no custody battle, no need to dig up dirt or hire investigators. His client was walking away with everything she wanted without having to work for any of it. If only he knew how wrong he was. "Very well," the judge said, her tone suggesting she still found the whole proceeding strange. "I hereby grant the divorce decree as requested. Mrs. Holloway, you are awarded full custody of Sophie Holloway, spousal support of $4,000 per month, and the division of assets as outlined. Mr. Holloway, do you have anything you'd like to say before we conclude?" I stood up slowly, my knees protesting after sitting in the uncomfortable wooden chair for over an hour. The manila envelope crinkled slightly as I adjusted my jacket. "No, Your Honor. I think everything will speak for itself." Brooke turned to look at me then, and for just a moment I saw something flicker in her eyes. Uncertainty, maybe, or the first hint that she should have been more careful about what she wished for. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. "Court dismissed." As people began to gather their things and file out, Brooke stood up and smoothed her skirt. She turned toward me with that victorious smile, the one that said she'd gotten everything she wanted and I was too weak or too broken to stop her. "Well," she said loud enough for everyone still in earshot to hear, "I guess that's that. I hope you've learned something from all this, Philip." I looked at her for a long moment, this woman I'd loved for most of my adult life, this woman who'd given me 3 children and 39 years of what I'd thought was happiness. Her blue eyes were bright with triumph, her chin raised in that defiant way that had once seemed charming but now just looked cruel. "Oh, I've learned quite a lot," I said quietly, patting the envelope in my jacket pocket. "More than you know." Something in my tone must have registered, because her smile faltered slightly. But then David was at my elbow, my mother was approaching with tears in her eyes, and the moment passed. Brooke gathered her purse and swept out of the courtroom with her lawyer, no doubt planning to call her sister and friends to share the good news about how completely she'd won. But as I stood there in that cold courthouse watching her leave, I couldn't help thinking about something my father had told me years ago. "Son," he'd said, "the worst thing you can do to someone who thinks they've outsmarted you is to let them keep thinking it right up until the moment they realize they haven't." The envelope in my pocket seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. Soon, very soon now, Brooke was going to learn that her victory celebration had been premature, because what she didn't know, what none of them knew except for me and the lab technician who'd processed the samples, was that this wasn't the end of anything. It was just the beginning. 3 months before that courthouse scene, I was sitting in my home office at 2 in the morning, staring at a photograph I'd found in Brooke's jewelry box, while looking for my grandmother's ring to give to Emma for her anniversary. The photo showed Brooke laughing with a man I didn't recognize, their faces close together, her hand on his arm in a way that spoke of intimacy I hadn't seen from her in years. But it wasn't the photo that had started my investigation. It was something much simpler, much more devastating. It was Sophie asking me why she didn't have my green eyes when she'd been filling out some medical form for her art school application. "Dad," she'd said, looking up from the kitchen table where she'd spread out her paperwork, "the form asks about family medical history. Do you think it matters that I have brown eyes and you have green ones? I mean, genetically speaking?" I'd been pouring myself coffee, getting ready for another day at the engineering firm where I'd worked for 37 years. It was a Tuesday morning in March, raining lightly, the kind of day that feels ordinary until it isn't anymore. "Well," I'd said, setting down my mug and really looking at her for the first time in a while, "brown eyes are dominant, so it's possible. Your mother has brown eyes." But even as I said it, something nagged at me. Sophie had always been different from Emma and Jake, not just in coloring, but in temperament, in interests, in the way she moved through the world. Emma looked like a feminine version of me. Same angular face, same stubborn jaw, same way of tilting her head when she was thinking. Jake had my height and my hands, though his personality had always been more like Brooke's family. Sophie, with her delicate features and creative soul and those deep brown eyes that held secrets I couldn't read. I'd pushed the thought away that morning, told myself I was being ridiculous. But over the next few weeks, it kept coming back. Little things started bothering me. The way Brooke would change the subject whenever I mentioned how different Sophie seemed from the rest of us. The fact that I couldn't remember much about Brooke's pregnancy with Sophie. How she'd seemed distant during that time, more secretive. And then there were the dates. Sophie had been born on December 15, 1994. If I counted backward 9 months, that put conception around March of 1994. March, when I'd been in Portland for 6 weeks overseeing the construction of the Harbor Bridge project. March, when Brooke had been unusually supportive of my extended absence, even suggesting I stay longer to make sure everything went smoothly. At the time, I'd thought she was just being understanding about my work. Now, sitting in my office with that photograph in my hands, I wondered if she'd had other reasons for wanting me out of town. I'd started paying attention differently after that. Really watching, really listening. I noticed how Brooke's college friends would sometimes exchange glances when Sophie was mentioned. How her sister Janet would get that careful look on her face whenever family resemblances came up in conversation. How Brooke herself seemed to deflect any discussion about Sophie's childhood, her baby pictures, the early years I'd been too busy working to fully participate in. "You were always traveling then," she'd say when I'd bring up wanting to see Sophie's first steps or hear about her first words. "You missed so much of her early development." I'd accepted that guilt for years, carried it like a stone in my chest, the father who'd been too focused on providing to be present. But now I was starting to wonder if my absence had been more convenient than coincidental. The real investigation had started in April. I'd hired a private investigator, a woman named Linda Morris, who specialized in discrete family matters. She was in her 50s, gray-haired and professional, with the kind of face that people trusted without thinking about why. "Mr. Holloway," she'd said during our first meeting in her downtown office, "I need you to understand that once we start looking into this, there's no going back. Whatever we find, you're going to have to live with." I'd nodded, but I don't think I really understood what she meant until she started presenting her findings. Bank records showing cash withdrawals from Brooke's personal account during the months I was traveling. Credit card receipts from restaurants and hotels I'd never been to. Phone records with calls to a number registered to someone named Marcus Webb. Marcus Webb, the man in the photograph. He was a contractor working on the community center renovation in 1994, Linda had explained, sliding another folder across her desk. According to public records, he was married at the time, had 2 kids of his own. The project ran from February through May of that year. February through May. Right when I was in Portland. Right when Sophie would have been conceived. "There's more," Linda had said gently. "I tracked down some of the other workers from that project. A few of them remember seeing your wife around the construction site frequently, more frequently than would be normal for someone just checking on community center progress. I'd stared at the documents spread across her desk, my hands shaking slightly as I absorbed what she was telling me. 30 years. For 30 years, I'd loved Sophie as my own daughter. I'd taught her to ride a bike, helped her with algebra homework, walked her to school when she was afraid of the neighbor's dog. I'd been proud of her artistic talents, supported her dreams even when they didn't make financial sense, defended her choices to my more traditional relatives. And all that time, there was a chance she wasn't even mine. "What about Jake?" I'd asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Linda had consulted another file. "Jake was born in 1991. You would have been home during conception, but—" She'd paused, choosing her words carefully. "There are some inconsistencies in the timeline there, too. I found evidence of your wife meeting regularly with a man named David Park during the summer of 1990. He was a tennis instructor at the country club where she was taking lessons. Jake, my son who'd struggled with alcoholism, who'd never quite found his place in the world, who'd always seemed to resent me for reasons I couldn't understand. Suddenly, his hostility made a different kind of sense. And Emma?" I'd forced myself to ask. "Emma appears to be yours," Linda had said, and I'd felt a rush of relief followed immediately by guilt for feeling relieved. "Conception timeline matches, and frankly, she looks exactly like you did at that age. I found your old high school photos in the newspaper archives." So Emma was mine, 1 out of 3. The daughter who'd grown up to be a successful attorney, who'd married well, who called me every Sunday and remembered my birthday, the one who'd always been the most like me, the one who might be the only one who actually shared my blood. Linda had given me the contact information for a discrete DNA testing lab. "You can get the samples without them knowing," she'd explained. "Hair from brushes, drinking glasses, things like that. The lab will need samples from you and from each child." Getting the samples had been easier than I'd expected. A few hairs from Sophie's hairbrush when she was out at her art class. Jake's coffee mug after he'd visited for Sunday dinner, Emma's water glass from her last visit with the grandkids. The hardest part had been waiting for the results. 2 weeks. 2 weeks of pretending everything was normal while my world collapsed around me. 2 weeks of watching Brooke move through our house, making dinner, commenting on the weather, asking about my day at work, all while knowing that she'd spent our entire marriage lying to me about the most fundamental thing possible. The call came on a Thursday afternoon in May. I was in my car, parked outside the grocery store, when my phone rang. "Mr. Holloway? This is Dr. Patricia Whitman from Accurate Genetic Testing. I have your results." My hands had been shaking so badly I'd almost dropped the phone. "Go ahead." "Emma Holloway is confirmed as your biological daughter with 99.9% certainty. However, the tests for Jake and Sophie Holloway show no biological relationship to you." The world had tilted sideways. Even though I'd suspected, even though I'd hired investigators and gathered evidence, hearing it confirmed felt like being hit by a truck. Neither Jake nor Sophie was mine. 2 of my 3 children, the ones I'd loved and supported and worried about for decades, shared no blood with me at all. I'd sat in that grocery store parking lot for over an hour, watching people walk in and out with their normal problems, their everyday concerns about what to make for dinner or whether they needed milk or bread. Meanwhile, my entire understanding of my own life was crumbling. That night, I'd gone home and looked at our family photos with new eyes. Christmas mornings, birthday parties, graduations, vacations, all of it built on a lie. All of it tainted by Brooke's deception. But the strangest thing was, it didn't change how I felt about Jake and Sophie. The love was still there, complicated now by hurt and confusion, but still real. They were still the kids I'd raised, even if they weren't the kids I'd made. What had changed was how I felt about Brooke. For 39 years, I'd thought I was married to someone who occasionally frustrated me, who could be demanding and sometimes petty, but who was fundamentally the mother of my children and my partner in life. Now I knew I was married to a stranger. Someone who could look me in the eye every day for 3 decades while keeping secrets that went to the core of who we were as a family. Someone who could let me love children as my own while knowing they weren't. Someone who could build an entire life on a foundation of lies and never lose a moment's sleep over it. That's when I'd started planning. Not for revenge exactly, but for truth. For the moment when all the careful constructions and convenient fictions would finally come tumbling down. Because Brooke had been right about one thing that morning in the kitchen when she'd screamed at me about the divorce. I did think I could walk away from this family, but not the way she thought and not for the reasons she assumed. I was walking away because they weren't my family at all, and it was time for everyone to know it. The call came exactly 1 week after the divorce was finalized. I was sitting in my new apartment, a modest 2-bedroom place downtown that I'd rented the day after moving out of the house on Maple Street. The morning sun streamed through unfamiliar windows, casting shadows across boxes I hadn't yet unpacked, when my phone buzzed with David Chen's number. "Philip, we need to meet, today if possible." His voice was tense in a way I hadn't heard before. "Brooke's attorney contacted me this morning. Apparently she wants to discuss modifying the custody arrangement." I set down my coffee cup, feeling the first spark of satisfaction I'd experienced in months. Modifying it? How? "She's asking for a formal no-contact order, complete severance of your parental rights to Sophie. She claims you've been—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "She claims you've been harassing the family, trying to manipulate Sophie against her." Of course she was. I'd been waiting for this move, actually surprised it had taken her a full week to make it. Brooke couldn't stand not having complete control, and my calm acceptance of the divorce terms had clearly unsettled her more than she'd expected. "When can you meet?" I asked. 2 o'clock? My office? "I'll be there. And David, bring your calendar. We're going to need to schedule a few more meetings after this one." The law offices of Chen and Associates occupied the 15th floor of a glass building that overlooked the river. I'd always liked David's approach to legal work, methodical and thorough without being unnecessarily aggressive. Today, though, I needed him to understand that methodical wasn't going to be enough. He was waiting for me in the conference room, case files spread across the mahogany table, looking every bit the serious young attorney who'd graduated top of his class from Columbia. What he didn't look like was someone prepared for the conversation we were about to have. "Philip," he said as I settled into the chair across from him, "I have to ask you directly. Have you been contacting Sophie? Brooke says you've been calling her, showing up at her art studio, trying to turn her against the divorce settlement." I pulled the manila envelope from my jacket pocket and placed it on the table between us. The same envelope I'd carried to court a week ago, its contents still sealed and waiting for the right moment. "I haven't contacted Sophie at all," I said quietly. "But I think it's time she contacted me." David frowned, looking at the envelope. "What's this about?" "Open it." He hesitated, then broke the seal and pulled out the 3 sheets of paper inside. I watched his face change as he read the letterhead from Accurate Genetic Testing, watched his eyes widen as he absorbed the results, watched his professional composure crack as he understood what he was looking at. "Jesus Christ, Philip." He looked up at me, then back at the papers. "How long have you known about this?" "Since May. I had the test done 2 months before Brooke filed for divorce." "And you didn't tell me?" His voice was sharp now, the tone of an attorney who'd just realized his client had been playing a much deeper game than anyone suspected. "Do you understand what this means? What we could have done with this information during the proceedings?" I leaned back in my chair, studying his face. David was a good lawyer, but he was young. He still thought about legal battles in terms of winning and losing, tactics and strategy. He didn't understand that sometimes the most powerful move is the one your opponent never sees coming. "What it means," I said carefully, "is that Brooke has been living a lie for 30 years, and now she's about to find out that lies have consequences." David was scanning the documents again, his legal mind already working through the implications. "This changes everything. Custody, support obligations, asset division. If Sophie and Jake aren't your biological children, then Brooke has been committing fraud for 3 decades. making me financially responsible for children that weren't mine, while sleeping with other men and passing their children off as mine. The words hung in the air between us, like a challenge. David set the papers down and looked at me with new eyes, finally understanding that the quiet, agreeable client he thought he knew had been something else entirely. "Why didn't you use this during the divorce?" he asked. "Because I wanted to see how far she'd go. I wanted to know exactly what she thought she could get away with." I reached for the papers, carefully placing them back in the envelope. "And because I wanted her to feel safe, confident, victorious." David shook his head slowly. "Philip, this is nuclear. When this comes out, it's going to destroy her completely." "Yes," I said simply. "It is." He was quiet for a long moment, staring out the conference room windows at the city below. When he spoke again, his voice was different, more cautious. "What do you want to do with this information?" "I want to schedule a family meeting, all of them. Emma, Jake, Sophie, Brooke. I want them all in one room when I tell them the truth." "That's—" He paused, clearly struggling with the ethics of what I was proposing. "That's going to be devastating for the kids, for Sophie especially." I felt the familiar tightness in my chest, the same pain that had been my constant companion since that phone call from Dr. Whitman. Sophie, my baby girl, who'd inherited her artistic soul from someone I'd never met. Jake, my troubled son, whose anger and resentment suddenly made perfect sense. "They deserve to know the truth," I said. "All of them. Emma deserves to know she's my only biological child. Jake and Sophie deserve to know why they never quite fit, why they always felt different, and Brooke—" I paused, feeling something cold and final settle in my chest. "Brooke deserves to face what she's done." David was taking notes now, his pen moving across the legal pad in quick, precise strokes. "We'll need to think about this carefully. The timing, the setting, how we present the information, and we'll need to consider the legal ramifications. This could affect child support obligations, inheritance rights, a dozen other things." "I've been thinking about it for months," I told him. "Every angle, every consequence. I'm ready." He looked up from his notes. "What about Brooke's request for the no-contact order?" I smiled then, the first genuine smile I'd felt in weeks. "Tell her attorney we'd be happy to discuss it. In fact, tell him I think a family meeting would be the perfect venue to address all of Brooke's concerns about my relationship with the children." David's eyes widened as he understood what I was suggesting. "You want to use her own legal maneuver against her?" "She wants to cut me off from Sophie completely. She thinks I'm going to just disappear quietly, pay my support obligations, and let her rewrite the story however she wants." I stood up, straightening my jacket. "She's about to learn that she's been very, very wrong about a lot of things." As I walked toward the door, David called after me. "Philip, are you sure about this? Once we start down this path, there's no going back. Relationships will be destroyed. Your family will never be the same." I stopped with my hand on the doorknob, thinking about 30 years of Sunday dinners, birthday parties, Christmas mornings, 30 years of believing I was part of something real, something built on love and trust and shared history. "David," I said without turning around, "my family was destroyed the moment Brooke decided to build it on lies. I'm just finally ready to stop pretending otherwise." The meeting was scheduled for the following Friday at 2 o'clock in David's conference room. Neutral territory, professional setting, witnesses present. Brooke's attorney had agreed readily, probably thinking this would be a simple matter of formalizing the no-contact arrangement his client wanted. I spent the week preparing, not legally but emotionally. I practiced what I was going to say, how I was going to say it. I thought about Emma's face when she learned the truth, about Jake's reaction when he finally understood why he'd always felt like an outsider in his own family. Mostly I thought about Sophie. Beautiful, talented Sophie who'd inherited her creativity from a stranger and her stubborn streak from the man who'd raised her, but not made her. On Thursday night I called my mother. "Philip?" Her voice was worried, the way it had been since the divorce. "Are you all right? You sound strange." "I'm fine, Mom. I'm actually better than I've been in a long time." I settled into my new living room chair, looking out at the city lights. I wanted you to know that tomorrow everything is going to change. Everything you think you know about Brooke, about the kids, about our family. What are you talking about? You'll know soon enough. But Mom, I need you to promise me something. No matter what you hear, no matter how bad it gets, remember that I love those children. All of them. That's never going to change. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft and knowing in the way that only mothers can be. Philip, what did you find out? The truth, Mom. I found out the truth. Friday morning dawned, clear and cold, the kind of autumn day that makes you think about endings and new beginnings. I dressed carefully, wearing my best suit, my father's watch, the tie Emma had given me for my 60th birthday. As I walked into David's office building, I felt the weight of the envelope in my pocket one last time. Soon it wouldn't be my secret anymore. Soon everyone would know what Brooke had done, what she'd stolen from all of us. The elevator ride to the 15th floor felt like the longest 2 minutes of my life. But when the doors opened and I stepped into the hallway, I wasn't nervous anymore. I was ready to tell my family the truth, all of it, even if it destroyed us completely. They were all there when I walked into the conference room at exactly 2 o'clock. Emma sat closest to the door, her lawyer instincts probably telling her to position herself where she could observe everyone's reactions. She looked polished and professional in her dark gray suit, but I could see the tension around her eyes, the way she kept checking her phone as if hoping for an escape. Jake slumped in his chair at the far end of the table, wearing a wrinkled button-down shirt that smelled faintly of cigarettes. He'd driven up from Portland that morning, probably stopping at a bar on the way based on the slight tremor in his hands and the way he avoided eye contact. At 33, he still looked like a teenager who'd gotten called to the principal's office. Sophie sat between them, her long brown hair pulled back in the messy bun she favored when she was nervous. She wore a paint-stained sweater over dark jeans, and she kept fidgeting with the silver bracelet I'd given her for her 21st birthday. When our eyes met, she gave me a small, uncertain smile that nearly broke my heart. And then there was Brooke. She'd chosen her seat at the head of the table naturally, positioned like a queen holding court. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, her navy blue dress the same one she'd worn to court a week ago. She looked confident, almost smug, like a woman who'd finally gotten everything she wanted and was prepared to enjoy it. Her attorney, Marcus Webb, sat beside her. Not the Marcus Webb from her past, but the irony of the shared name wasn't lost on me. This Marcus was younger, eager, the kind of lawyer who took cases like this because they seemed simple and lucrative. "Thank you all for coming," David began, settling into his chair with a thick folder in front of him. "As you know, we're here to discuss Mrs. Holloway's request for a formal modification of the custody arrangement." Brooke leaned forward slightly, her hands clasped on the table. "I want to make it clear that this isn't personal. Philip has been through a difficult time with the divorce, and I think it's best for everyone, especially Sophie, if we establish some clear boundaries moving forward." Sophie frowned. "What kind of boundaries?" "Legal boundaries," Brooke's attorney said smoothly. "Your mother feels that a clean break would be healthiest for all parties involved." Emma, who'd been quiet until now, finally spoke up. "Are we talking about cutting Dad off from Sophie completely? That seems extreme." "It's not extreme when you consider the circumstances," Brooke said, her voice taking on that reasonable tone she used when she was about to say something unreasonable. "Your father has been acting strangely since the divorce, calling at odd hours, asking inappropriate questions about our family history, making Sophie uncomfortable." I hadn't said a word yet, but I could feel everyone's attention shifting toward me. Jake looked up for the first time since I'd entered the room, his bloodshot eyes curious despite his apparent hangover. "Philip," David said gently, "would you like to respond to these allegations?" I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the manila envelope. The same envelope I'd carried for weeks, waiting for this moment. I set it on the table in front of me, my hands steady despite the enormity of what I was about to do. "I haven't been calling anyone," I said quietly. "I haven't been asking inappropriate questions, but I have been trying to figure out how to tell my children something very important." Brooke's eyes fixed on the envelope, and I saw the first flicker of uncertainty cross her face. "What are you talking about?" I looked around the table at the three people I'd raised as my own children, these young adults I'd loved and worried about and been proud of for their entire lives. Emma with her father's stubbornness and drive, Jake with his wounded anger that had never made sense until now, Sophie with her gentle heart and artistic soul. "I'm talking about the truth," I said, "about who we really are as a family, about lies that have been told for 30 years. The room fell silent. Even Brooke's attorney stopped taking notes, sensing that whatever was about to happen was bigger than a simple custody modification. I opened the envelope and pulled out the DNA test results, setting them on the table where everyone could see the letterhead. 3 months ago, I had genetic testing done, on myself and on each of my children. Emma leaned forward, her lawyer training kicking in. "Dad, what is this about?" "It's about the fact that Jake and Sophie are not my biological children." The words dropped into the silence like stones into still water. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then Sophie laughed, a nervous, disbelieving sound. "That's ridiculous. Of course we're your children." Jake was staring at the papers, his face pale. "What do you mean, not biological?" I picked up the first sheet and handed it to Emma. "Your test confirms what I always knew. You're my daughter, genetically and in every other way that matters." Then I handed the second sheet to Jake. "But this test shows no biological relationship between you and me." Jake's hands shook as he read the results. His face went through a series of expressions: confusion, understanding, and finally a kind of terrible relief. "Jesus," he whispered. "Jesus Christ." Sophie grabbed the third sheet before I could hand it to her. I watched her scan the scientific language, saw the exact moment when she understood what she was reading. Her face went white, then flushed, then white again. "This can't be right," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This has to be a mistake." Brooke hadn't moved. She sat frozen in her chair, staring at the papers like they were poisonous snakes that might strike at any moment. "Mom?" Sophie turned to her, confusion and hurt clear in her voice. "Tell them this is wrong. Tell them these tests are wrong." Everyone looked at Brooke. The silence stretched out, seconds ticking by on the wall clock, until it became clear that she wasn't going to deny it. "You knew," Emma said, her voice flat and cold. "You knew this whole time." Jake suddenly slammed his hand on the table, making everyone jump. "Are you kidding me? Are you fucking kidding me?" His voice was getting louder, all the anger and confusion of 33 years finally finding a target. "You let him raise me, pay for my college, worry about my drinking problem, and I'm not even his kid." "Jake, please," Brooke said, finally finding her voice. "This isn't how I wanted you to find out." "How you wanted me to find out?" Sophie stood up so abruptly her chair rolled backward. "How long were you planning to wait? Until you were dead? Until we were old enough that it didn't matter anymore?" Emma was still reading through the test results, her legal mind processing the implications. "Mom, this affects inheritance rights, support obligations, medical decisions. How could you keep this secret for 30 years? Brooke looked around the table at her children, at me, at the lawyers who were witnessing the complete destruction of our family's foundation. When she spoke, her voice was defensive, almost petulant. "I did what I thought was best for everyone. Philip was a good father, a good provider. The biological details didn't matter." "Didn't matter?" Jake's voice cracked. "I spent my whole life feeling like I didn't belong, like there was something wrong with me because I wasn't like him, and it didn't matter?" Sophie was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face. "Who is my father? Do I have siblings I don't know about? A whole family I've never met?" I reached across the table toward her, but she pulled her hand away. The rejection hit me like a physical blow, but I understood it. Everything she thought she knew about herself, about her place in the world, had just been shattered. "I have the names," I said quietly. "If you want them, if you're ready for that information." Brooks' attorney was frantically taking notes, probably trying to figure out how to salvage his client's position. But there was no salvaging this. The truth was out, spreading through the room like spilled ink, staining everything it touched. "You planned this," Brooks said suddenly, turning on me with venomous eyes. "You've been planning this whole scene, this humiliation. You wanted to destroy me." I looked at her, this woman I'd shared a life with for nearly 4 decades, this woman who'd been lying to me since before our youngest child was born. "I didn't destroy anything, Brooke. I just stopped pretending that lies were the same thing as love." Emma stood up slowly, gathering the test results. "I need some air," she said. "I need to think about this." Jake was already heading for the door. "I need a drink," he muttered. "Hell, I need several drinks." Sophie remained sitting, staring at her hands. When she finally looked up at me, her brown eyes were filled with a pain that cut straight through my chest. "Do you still love me?" she asked, her voice small and broken. "Even though I'm not really your daughter?" I got up from my chair and walked around the table to where she sat. Slowly, carefully, I reached out and took her hands in mine. "Sophie," I said, looking directly into those brown eyes that had never belonged to me genetically, but had always belonged to me in every way that mattered. "You will always be my daughter. Biology doesn't change 30 years of love." She collapsed against me then, sobbing into my shoulder while I held her, and whispered the same words I'd been telling her since she was small, that she was loved, that she was precious, that nothing could ever change that. Behind us, Brooke was arguing with the lawyers about legal implications and custody rights, but her voice seemed to come from very far away. All that mattered was Sophie in my arms, and the knowledge that whatever else happened, whatever other relationships were destroyed by the truth, this one might still be salvageable. When Sophie finally pulled away, she wiped her eyes and looked at me with something like her old smile. "I'm still going to call you Dad," she said, "if that's okay." "It's more than okay," I told her. "It's everything." As we left the conference room together, I caught a glimpse of Brooke's face. The confident mask had finally slipped, revealing something desperate and defeated underneath. She'd gotten exactly what she asked for in the divorce proceedings. She just hadn't realized that sometimes getting what you want is the worst thing that can happen to you. The phone call started 3 days after the family meeting. First Emma, then Jake, then Sophie again, each one struggling to process what they'd learned, what it meant for their understanding of themselves and their place in the world. Emma's call came while I was unpacking books in my new apartment, trying to create some sense of normalcy in a space that still felt temporary. "Dad," she said without preamble when I answered, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." I set down the copy of Moby Dick I'd been holding, the same edition I'd read to her when she was 8 years old and going through her adventure story phase. "Of course." "Did you know? Before the tests, I mean. Did you suspect that Jake and Sophie weren't yours?" The question I'd been dreading. The one that got to the heart of whether I was a victim or a fool, whether I'd been betrayed or simply willfully blind. "I suspected about Sophie for a few months," I admitted. "Something about the timing never quite made sense, and she's so different from the rest of us. But Jake—" I paused, thinking about all the years of tension between us, all the arguments and disappointments. I convinced myself his problems were just personality differences. It never occurred to me that there might be a biological reason he always felt like an outsider. Emma was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, more vulnerable than I'd heard it in years. "I keep thinking about Christmas mornings when we were kids. How you'd always make sure Jake and Sophie got the same attention I did, even when they were being difficult. How you never played favorites even though—" She trailed off. "Even though you were the only one who was actually mine?" "Yeah." Her voice cracked slightly. "How did you do that? How did you love them the same?" I walked to my new living room window, looking out at the city below. Somewhere out there, Jake was probably drinking himself into oblivion, trying to process 33 years of feeling like he didn't belong. Somewhere else, Sophie was staring at a canvas, wondering if her artistic talent came from a stranger she'd never met. "Because they were yours too," I said finally. "Maybe not biologically, but in every way that actually matters. I changed their diapers, walked the floor with them when they were teething, taught them to ride bikes and helped with homework. Biology is just genetics, Emma. Love is a choice you make every day." She was crying now, soft sniffles that reminded me of the little girl who used to crawl into my lap when she was scared. "I'm so angry at her, Dad, at Mom. How could she do this to all of us?" That was the question I'd been asking myself for months, ever since Dr. Whitman's phone call had confirmed what I'd started to suspect. How does someone build a life on a foundation of lies and never lose sleep over it? "I don't know," I said honestly. "I thought I knew her, but apparently I never really did." The second call came from Jake, and it was harder. He was drunk, calling from a bar in Portland, where he'd apparently been holding court since the family meeting, telling anyone who would listen about his family's spectacular implosion. "You know what the funny thing is?" He slurred into the phone, the background noise of conversations and clinking glasses making it hard to hear him clearly. "I always thought you hated me. All those years I thought there was something wrong with me because I couldn't make you proud." My chest tightened. "Jake, I never hated you, and there's nothing wrong with you." "But there is, though, isn't there? I mean, I'm not really your son. I'm just some random kid you got stuck raising because my mother was a liar." "You're not random," I said firmly, wishing I could reach through the phone and shake him sober. "And you're not someone I got stuck with. You're my son, maybe not by blood, but by choice." He laughed, a bitter sound that had nothing to do with humor. "By choice? Really? Because it seems like if you'd had a choice, you would have chosen differently." "Jake, listen to me." I sat down heavily in my new armchair, the one that didn't have 30 years of family memories attached to it. If someone had offered me the choice 33 years ago, if they'd said you could either raise this baby who isn't biologically yours or walk away, I would have chosen you every time. The line went quiet, except for the bar noise in the background. Finally, Jake spoke, his voice smaller, more vulnerable. "I need some time to figure this out, okay? This whole thing, it's a lot." "Take all the time you need," I told him. "I'll be here when you're ready." Sophie's calls were the most frequent and the most heartbreaking. She would phone at odd hours, sometimes just to hear my voice, sometimes with questions about her biological father that I didn't have answers to yet. "I keep staring at myself in the mirror," she told me during one late-night conversation, "trying to see if I look like him, wondering if I inherited my love of painting from him, or if that's just something that happened to develop on its own." "Does it matter?" I asked gently. "I don't know. Maybe. I just feel like I don't know who I am anymore." She paused, and I could hear her moving around her apartment, probably pacing the way she did when she was anxious. "Mom won't talk about him. Every time I bring it up, she changes the subject or starts crying." Brooke, the woman who'd orchestrated this entire deception, was now playing the victim, making her children feel guilty for wanting to know the truth about their own origins. "I have his name," I said. "And the private investigator I hired found some information about him. When you're ready, I can share what I know." "What if he doesn't want to meet me? What if he has a whole other family and doesn't want his past mistakes showing up on his doorstep?" The pain in her voice was almost unbearable. This beautiful, talented young woman was now questioning her very existence, wondering if she was just a mistake someone wanted to forget. "Sophie, you're not a mistake. You're one of the best things that ever happened to my life, regardless of genetics. And if your biological father can't see that, then he's the one missing out." But the hardest call wasn't from any of my children. It was from Brooke herself, exactly 1 week after the family meeting. I almost didn't answer when her name appeared on my screen. We'd had no contact since that day in the conference room when her carefully constructed world had come crashing down. But curiosity got the better of me. "What do you want, Brooke?" Her voice was different than I'd ever heard it before, stripped of its usual confidence and manipulation. She sounded tired, defeated. "I want to explain." "Explain what? How you lied to me for 30 years? How you let me raise children as my own while knowing they weren't. How you built our entire marriage on deception. Please, Philip, just please listen. Something in her tone made me pause. This wasn't the Brooke who'd smiled victoriously in the courtroom or the one who'd demanded a no-contact order. This was someone who sounded genuinely broken. I'm listening. She took a shaky breath. It wasn't supposed to happen the way it did. With Marcus, it was just, you were gone so much in those days, and I was lonely and he was there. So you had an affair. That doesn't explain the lies, Brooke. That doesn't explain letting me believe Sophie was mine. Because by the time I realized I was pregnant, I wasn't sure whose baby it was. And you were so happy when I told you. You'd been talking about wanting another child, and when I saw your face. She trailed off, crying now. So you decided to just hope for the best? I decided to give our family the best chance I could. You were a wonderful father, Philip. Better than Marcus would have been. Better than David would have been with Jake. David, the tennis instructor. Another name, another betrayal. You had no right to make that decision for me, I said, my voice harder than I'd intended. You had no right to steal 30 years of my life. I didn't steal anything. The old Brooke was back now, defensive and angry. I gave you children to love. I gave you a family. How is that stealing? Because it was built on lies. Because every day for 30 years I looked at Jake and Sophie and felt love for children who weren't mine, while their real fathers were out there somewhere, never knowing they existed. Their real father is you, she said fiercely. You're the one who raised them. You're the one who taught Sophie to paint and helped Jake with his homework, and you're the one who made sure I did it all under false pretenses. The silence stretched between us. 39 years of marriage reduced to this bitter exchange of accusations and justifications. The lawyers want to renegotiate the settlement, she said finally, her voice small again. Of course they did. With the revelation that Jake and Sophie weren't my biological children, my support obligations were now questionable. The house, the assets, everything would need to be reconsidered. I figured they would. You could take everything from me now, the house, the money, everything. I know that. I closed my eyes, thinking about the house on Maple Street where we'd raised 3 children, where we'd celebrated birthdays and holidays and anniversaries, where I'd believed I was living with a family who belonged to me. What do you want me to say, Brooke? I want you to say you'll be fair, that you won't punish me for trying to keep our family together. Is that what you think you were doing, keeping our family together? Yes. Her voice was barely a whisper now. I thought if you never knew it wouldn't matter. You loved them so much and they loved you. I thought that was enough. It wasn't your decision to make. After I hung up, I sat in my quiet apartment for a long time, thinking about choices and consequences, about the difference between love and lies. Somewhere across town, Brooke was probably sitting in our old house, surrounded by the remnants of a life that had been revealed to be largely fictional. Tomorrow, I would meet with David to discuss the legal implications of everything that had been revealed. Tomorrow, I would start the process of rebuilding relationships with Jake and Sophie based on honesty instead of deception. But tonight, I just sat in my new home and grieved for the family I'd thought I had, the life I'd thought I'd lived, and the 39 years of marriage that had just been revealed to be something else entirely. The truth had set me free, but freedom, I was learning, could be a lonely place to start over. 6 months after the family meeting, I was sitting in Sophie's art studio, watching her put the finishing touches on a painting that took my breath away. It was a portrait of hands, but not just any hands. These were weathered, strong hands, holding a small paintbrush with infinite gentleness. They were my hands, painted from memory, and they were beautiful in a way that made my throat tight with emotion. "Do you like it?" she asked, stepping back to study her work with the critical eye she'd developed over years of turning pain into art. "I love it," I said honestly. "But why my hands?" She wiped paint from her fingers with a rag that had seen countless masterpieces in progress. "Because they're the hands that taught me to hold a brush when I was 5. They're the hands that steadied mine when I was learning to write my name. Biology doesn't change history, Dad." In the month since the DNA revelation, Sophie and I had grown closer than we'd ever been. The shock of learning I wasn't her biological father had initially driven a wedge between us, but as we'd worked through it together, something deeper had emerged. Our relationship was no longer based on assumption or obligation. It was based on choice. She'd decided to learn about Marcus Webb, her biological father. Through the private investigator, we'd discovered he was a contractor living in Seattle, married to the same woman he'd been cheating on during his affair with Brooke. He had 2 legitimate children, both grown, and when Sophie finally contacted him, his response had been predictably disappointing. "I made mistakes when I was younger," he'd told her during their one and only phone conversation. "I don't need them showing up now to complicate my life." His rejection had hurt her, but it had also clarified something important. As she'd said to me afterward, "A father isn't the person who donates DNA. A father is the person who shows up every day for 30 years. Jake's journey had been harder. He'd spent 3 months in rehab after our family meeting, finally admitting that his drinking wasn't just about feeling like an outsider in our family, but about feeling like an outsider everywhere. Learning about David Park, his biological father, had provided some answers, but not necessarily comfort. David was a successful businessman now, remarried with teenage children who knew nothing about his affair with Brooke 33 years ago. Unlike Marcus, he'd been willing to meet Jake, even eager to establish some kind of relationship. "He wants to get to know me," Jake had told me during one of our weekly coffee meetings, a new tradition we'd started as part of rebuilding our relationship on more honest ground. "He keeps talking about how I inherited his business sense, his ambition. But the thing is, I don't want his business sense. I don't want to be like him." "What do you want?" I'd asked. "I want to be like you," he'd said simply. "Maybe not genetically, but in the ways that matter. I want to be the kind of man who sticks around when things get hard, who keeps his commitments, who chooses his family every day instead of just getting stuck with them." Emma had become the bridge between all of us, using her legal training and natural diplomacy to help navigate the complex emotional and practical implications of our new reality. She'd been the one to suggest family therapy, something I'd initially resisted but had come to appreciate. "We need to learn how to be a family again," she'd said during one of our sessions with Dr. Martinez, a patient woman in her 50s who specialized in family trauma. "But this time, we need to do it honestly." The therapy had helped all of us, even revealing some things about Emma's own struggles with the revelation. As the only biological child, she'd felt guilty about her genetic connection to me, worried that Jake and Sophie might resent her for it. "I keep thinking I should feel special because I'm your real daughter," she'd admitted during one particularly difficult session. "But then I feel terrible for thinking that because it implies that Jake and Sophie are somehow less real." "You're all real," I'd told her, and I'd meant it. "Being my biological daughter doesn't make you more my child than Jake and Sophie are. It just makes you my child in a different way." The legal settlement with Brooke had been finalized 3 months ago. With the DNA results in evidence, the original divorce agreement had been modified significantly. I was no longer obligated to pay spousal support, and my child support obligations for Jake and Sophie had been adjusted to reflect their changed status. Brooke had kept the house, but she'd had to take out a significant mortgage to buy out my equity. She'd also started working for the first time in decades, taking a job as an administrator at a dental office. The woman who'd once lived off my income was now struggling to make ends meet on her own. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I mostly felt sad. "Do you think she's learned anything from all this?" Sophie asked me one day as we walked through the park near her studio. "I think she's learned that actions have consequences," I said. "Whether that's the same as learning she was wrong, I don't know." Brooke and I had no contact now except through lawyers when necessary. She'd made a few attempts to reach out in the months immediately following the revelation, but they'd all been focused on damage control rather than genuine remorse. "I think she still believes she was protecting the family," Emma had observed. In her mind, she was the victim of circumstances, not the architect of deception. Maybe she was right. Maybe Brooke would never fully understand what she'd stolen from all of us, all those years of authentic relationship that had been poisoned by her lies. But I'd stopped needing her to understand. Her understanding wouldn't give me back those years, and it wouldn't change the choices I was making now. My new life had settled into rhythms that felt honest, in a way my old life never had. I'd started teaching part-time at the local community college, sharing my engineering knowledge with students who reminded me why I'd fallen in love with problem-solving in the first place. I'd also started dating, something that felt strange after 39 years of marriage, but also liberating. Margaret was a librarian I'd met at a continuing education class, a woman my age who'd been widowed 5 years ago and understood the complexity of starting over later in life. "I like that you're honest about your baggage," she'd told me after our third dinner together. "Too many men our age pretend they don't have complicated histories." "My history is definitely complicated," I'd said, and then I'd told her about the DNA tests, about the family meeting, about learning that 2 of my children weren't biologically mine. "And how do you feel about that now?" she'd asked. "Grateful," I'd said, surprising myself with the answer. Grateful that I got to be their father anyway. Grateful that love turned out to be stronger than genetics. Grateful that the truth finally came out so we could build something real. Now, standing in Sophie's studio looking at her painting of my hands, I felt that gratitude again. These hands had guided a paintbrush held by a little girl who wasn't my blood, but was absolutely my daughter. They'd signed report cards and permission slips and college applications for children who carried other men's genes but my values. "I have something to tell you," Sophie said, interrupting my reverie. She looked nervous, the way she had as a teenager when she'd needed to confess some minor transgression. "What is it?" "I've been talking to Jake about starting a business together, art therapy, for addiction recovery, combining his experience with sobriety and my art background." My heart swelled with pride, not just for the business idea, but for what it represented. Jake and Sophie, working together, using their shared experience of feeling like outsiders to help other people find their place in the world. "That sounds wonderful," I said. "What kind of help do you need?" She grinned, the same grin she'd had as a 5-year-old, presenting me with a crayon drawing she was particularly proud of. "Actually, we were hoping you might consider being our business advisor. Help us with the practical stuff, the planning and organization, if you want to, I mean." I looked around her studio at the paintings that lined the walls, each one a testament to her resilience and talent. I thought about Jake, 6 months sober and working to rebuild his life with the same determination he'd once applied to destroying it. I thought about Emma successfully balancing her career and family while helping hold the rest of us together. These were my children. Not because of DNA, but because of choice. Because of love that had survived the revelation that it was based on something deeper than genetics. "I would be honored," I said. As Sophie hugged me, I felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't experienced in months. Peace. Not the peace of ignorance or denial, but the peace of truth finally told, and relationships rebuilt on solid ground. My mother had been right that day she'd begged me not to give Brooke everything she wanted in the divorce. I shouldn't have given her everything, but in the end, I'd gotten something much more valuable in return. I'd gotten my children back, not as obligations or assumptions, but as choices we made every day to love each other, and for the first time in my 61 years, that felt like enough. That evening, I sat in my apartment with a cup of coffee and called my mother. "How are the kids?" she asked, the way she had every week since the family meeting. "They're good, Mom. We're all good." "And Brooke?" I considered the question. Brooke was struggling financially, isolated from the children she'd manipulated for years, facing the consequences of choices she still didn't fully understand. But she was also an adult who'd made those choices freely, and her consequences weren't my responsibility anymore. "Brooke is living with the results of her own decisions," I said, "just like the rest of us." "Are you happy, Philip?" I looked around my small apartment, thinking about Sophie's painting that would soon hang on my wall, about my coffee meetings with Jake, about Sunday dinners with Emma and her family, about Margaret and the possibility of love that wasn't built on lies. Yes, Mom, I think I finally am. After I hung up, I walked to the window and looked out at the city lights, thinking about second chances and new beginnings. Tomorrow, Sophie and Jake would come over to discuss their business plan. Next week, Margaret and I would go to the theater. Next month, Emma's youngest would have a birthday party where I'd be celebrated as Grandpa, a title that meant more to me now than it ever had when I'd assumed it was my biological right. The truth had cost me a marriage and the family I'd thought I had. But it had given me something better, the family I'd actually chosen and who had chosen me back. In the end, that was enough. It was everything.